There is a moment when everything you know becomes a question you cannot answer. Not the gentle doubt that asks for clarification, not the philosophical skepticism that enjoys its own cleverness, but the sudden collapse of the ground beneath you, when the foundations you built your entire life upon reveal themselves as sand, shifting, dissolving, leaving you standing in a void you did not know existed. Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali stood at the height of his brilliance and felt everything turn to ash. He was 37 years old, the most celebrated scholar in the Islamic world, professor at the Nizamiya University in Baghdad, the intellectual center of 11th century Islam. Students came from across the empire to hear him lecture on theology, jurisprudence, philosophy. His mind was a cathedral, his arguments were flawless, his reputation was unassailable, and he could not eat. His throat closed, his body refused, not from illness, but from a crisis that moved deeper than the body, a recognition that shattered the careful architecture of certainty he had spent his life constructing. He describes it later with devastating precision. I examined my knowledge and found that what I knew with certainty was very little. This was not humility, it was horror, because Al-Ghazali had dedicated his existence to the pursuit of certain knowledge. He had mastered theology, the rational defense of religious truth. He had studied philosophy, the Greek inheritance of Aristotle, systematized by Islamic thinkers like Avicenna and Al-Farabi. He had debated with the Ismailis, the esoteric sect that claimed hidden knowledge passed down through spiritual lineage. And now, standing at the peak of intellectual achievement, he realized he knew nothing with the kind of certainty that could withstand the question, how do you know that you know? This is the crisis Al-Ghazali named the architecture of doubt. It begins simply. You wake one morning and the things you believed seem less solid than they did yesterday. Not because you have new information, but because you have asked a question you cannot unanswer. What if I'm wrong? For most people, this question is manageable. You adjust, you reconsider, you move on. But for Al-Ghazali, the question was not theoretical. It was existential, because if he could not know anything with absolute certainty, then his entire life, his teaching, his scholarship, his religious authority was built on foundations he could not defend. He had taught students how to construct theological arguments. He had shown them how to refute heretics, how to defend orthodoxy, how to use reason in service of faith. But if he himself did not possess certainty, then what was he teaching? Inherited opinions, clever arguments, the appearance of knowledge without its substance, and this recognition paralyzed him. Not metaphorically, literally. His body stopped cooperating with the performance of certainty his position required. He could not lecture, he could not eat, he could not continue pretending that the edifice of his intellectual life was stable when he felt it crumbling beneath him. The question that consumed him was epistemological, the question of how knowledge is possible, but it was also psychological, spiritual, existential. It was the question every thinking person eventually confronts. How do I distinguish between what I actually know and what I merely believe I know? And once you ask this question seriously, once you refuse to accept comfortable answers, you discover something terrifying. Most of what you call knowledge is inherited assumption, cultural, conditioning, unexamined belief dressed up in the language of certainty. Al-Ghazali examined his sense perceptions first. Can I trust what I see, hear, touch? And he realized that senses deceive constantly. A straight stick looks bent in water. The sun appears small, though its vast dreams feel real while we are dreaming. If senses can deceive sometimes, how can we trust them ever? Then he examined reason, the faculty that corrects the errors of sense perception. Can I trust logical deduction? Can I know with certainty that 2 + 2 = 4, that contradictions cannot both be true, that effects follow from causes? And he discovered that even reason has limits. Because reason operates on axioms, it cannot prove. It assumes the law of non-contradiction. It assumes causation. It assumes that the principles which govern thought correspond to the principles which govern reality. But these are assumptions, not certainties. What if there is a higher faculty, something beyond reason, that would reveal reason's errors, the way reason reveals the errors of sense perception? What if the foundations of logic themselves are just another layer of illusion? This is where most skepticism stops. The skeptic says, we cannot know anything with certainty, therefore we should suspend judgment and live with uncertainty. But Al-Ghazali could not stop there, because uncertainty about everything, including morality and religious truth, makes life impossible. If nothing can be known, then there is no basis for choosing one action over another, no ground for affirming meaning or value, no way to distinguish truth from delusion. The skeptical crisis, if taken seriously, does not produce philosophical humility. It produces paralysis. And Al-Ghazali was paralyzed. For 2 months, he could not teach. He could not function. His students waited. His colleagues whispered. The institution that had elevated him to intellectual celebrity watched as its star professor stood silent before them, unable to speak because he had nothing left to say that he believed with certainty. This was not an intellectual game. It was a breakdown, the kind that happens when consciousness turns its gaze fully upon itself and discovers that the foundations it assumed were solid are made of inherited belief, social performance, the desire to belong to a tradition and be recognized as knowledgeable within it, and the terrifying recognition, I do not know if anything I have taught is true. I do not know if I can know. What Al-Ghazali experienced is what every serious thinker eventually confronts, the moment when all your certainties are revealed as constructions, when the scaffolding of belief that holds your world together becomes visible as scaffolding rather than foundation, when you realize that what you called knowledge was mostly performance, the recitation of acceptable answers to questions you inherited rather than chose. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. You can ignore it. You can suppress it. You can go back to performing certainty for the sake of function and social position, but you cannot unknow that you do not know. This is the architecture of doubt Al-Ghazali discovered. Knowledge is built on assumptions that cannot be proven, and once you question those assumptions, the entire structure threatens to collapse. Most people never reach this point. They live within inherited frameworks of meaning and call it knowledge. They repeat what they were taught and call it certainty. They perform the rituals of intellectual life without ever asking whether the rituals connect to something real. But some people cannot avoid the question. Some minds are structured such that once the question of certainty arises, it will not be silenced by convenient answers or social pressure to conform. Al-Ghazali was one of these people, and his crisis was not a weakness or a failure of intellect. It was the inevitable result of intellectual honesty pushed to its limit. He had reached the point where all paths forward seemed blocked. He could not continue teaching what he did not know with certainty. He could not accept skepticism as final answer because it made life meaningless. He could not return to naive belief because he had seen too clearly that belief is not the same as knowledge. He was trapped in what we might call epistemological paralysis, the state where consciousness has become so aware of the limits of its own knowing that it can no longer act on anything, because action requires commitment to some framework of meaning, and no framework can be proven absolutely. This is where his story begins, not with answers, but with the total collapse of the ground on which answers could be built, not with certainty, but with the recognition that certainty is the one thing human consciousness desperately needs and the one thing it cannot achieve through reason alone. What he did next, how he moved from paralysis to action, from doubt to a certainty that was different from the intellectual certainty he had lost, is the journey we are about to trace. But we must begin here, in the void where everything Al-Ghazali knew turned to question marks, where his body refused to continue performing knowledge he no longer possessed, where the architecture he had built collapsed and left him standing in ruins, asking the question that would define the rest of his life. If I cannot know anything with certainty through reason, how can I know anything at all? And if I cannot know, how can I live? When your world collapses, you go searching for what remains. Al-Ghazali had lost intellectual certainty, but he had not lost the need for truth. And this need, This hunger that would not be silenced by doubt drove him to investigate every path to knowledge available in his world. He identified 4 approaches that people used to claim they possessed truth, 4 traditions that promised certainty to those who followed them faithfully, and he resolved to test each one completely, to examine it from the inside rather than dismissing it from comfortable distance. This was not academic research, it was existential investigation, because Al-Ghazali was not trying to write a comparative study of epistemology. He was trying to find ground to stand on. He was trying to discover if certainty was possible, and if so, where it could be found. The first path belonged to the theologians, the mutakallimun, who defended religious truth through rational argument. Al-Ghazali knew this path intimately. He had been trained in it. He had mastered it. These were his people, his intellectual lineage. They used logic to prove God's existence, to demonstrate the possibility of prophecy, to show that revealed teachings were rationally coherent and philosophically defensible. Their method was sophisticated. Their arguments were powerful. They could silence skeptics and provide intellectual satisfaction to believers troubled by doubt. But Al-Ghazali discovered a fatal flaw. Theology begins with conclusions and then constructs arguments to defend them. The theologian does not follow evidence wherever it leads. The theologian starts with revealed truth and then shows that this truth is compatible with reason. The investigation is not genuinely open. The conclusion is predetermined. And this means that theological arguments, however clever, cannot provide the kind of certainty that survives honest questioning. Moreover, theology deals with concepts about God rather than direct knowledge of God. It can prove that God exists, but it cannot provide the experience of divine presence that transforms consciousness and answers the soul's deepest need. Theology, Al-Ghazali concluded, is defensive rather than generative. It protects existing belief from attack, but it cannot generate the kind of transformative knowledge that consciousness hungers for. The second path belonged to the philosophers, the inheritors of Aristotle, systematized by brilliant Islamic thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna. Al-Ghazali threw himself into philosophical study with the same intensity he had brought to theology. He mastered their texts, he learned their methods, he followed their arguments to their conclusions, and he was impressed by what he found. The philosophers had achieved remarkable things. In mathematics and logic, they had discovered truths that seemed certain and universal. In natural science, they had uncovered patterns in physical processes that enabled prediction and control. Their commitment to following reason wherever it led, regardless of whether conclusions supported popular belief, was admirable and rare. But when philosophers moved from logic and science into metaphysics, when they tried to use reason alone to answer ultimate questions about God, the soul, and the structure of reality, Al-Ghazali detected the same flaw he had found in theology, only in reverse, where theology started with revealed conclusions and defended them with reason. Philosophy started with rational method and claimed it could reach conclusions about ultimate reality through logic alone, and Al-Ghazali showed, in his devastating critique, the incoherence of the philosophers, that their metaphysical arguments were based on unproven assumptions rather than genuine demonstrations. Different philosophical schools reached contradictory conclusions about fundamental questions, which suggested that reason alone was insufficient for resolving them. The philosophers claimed the same certainty for their metaphysical speculations that they achieved in mathematics. But mathematical truths can be rigorously demonstrated from commonly accepted axioms, while metaphysical claims cannot. When you claim that the universe is eternal, or that God knows only universals and not particulars, or that bodily resurrection is impossible, you are making assertions that go beyond what reason can prove. Moreover, philosophy's arrogance troubled Al-Ghazali. When philosophical conclusions conflicted with revealed teaching, philosophers simply assumed that revelation must be reinterpreted to fit philosophical requirements. They placed human reason above divine disclosure, as if the finite mind could contain and correct the infinite. This was not just intellectually unjustified, it was spiritually dangerous, because it elevated human understanding above the wisdom that comes from sources beyond human capacity. The third path belonged to the Ismailis, an esoteric movement that claimed access to hidden knowledge passed down through spiritual lineage from divinely inspired leaders. This path appealed to Al-Ghazali's exhaustion with rational argument. The Ismailis promised to resolve all doubts through initiation into secret teachings that ordinary believers could never discover through their own efforts. They offered certainty without the painful work of investigation, truth delivered by authoritative transmission rather than personal struggle. But when Al-Ghazali examined their claims carefully, he found circular reasoning and empty assertions. The Ismailis claimed authority because they possessed secret knowledge. But when asked to demonstrate this knowledge, they could only point back to their claims of authority. They offered no evidence that their leaders actually knew what they claimed to know. Their teachings often contradicted established facts that could be verified independently, and their use of secrecy seemed designed to prevent examination rather than protect sacred truth. Al-Ghazali concluded that Ismailism was intellectual fraud, a system that exploited people's hunger for certainty without providing genuine satisfaction. And yet, something in the Ismaili approach lingered in his mind, the recognition that perhaps certain kinds of knowledge cannot be achieved through individual rational effort alone, that perhaps transformation requires submission to a teaching and a teacher, that perhaps the solitary intellect, however brilliant, needs guidance from sources beyond itself. This intuition would become crucial later. But first, Al-Ghazali had to investigate the fourth path, the Sufis. These were the mystics of Islam, the ones who claimed that truth could be known directly through spiritual experience, rather than through rational argument or authoritative transmission. They spoke of purifying the heart, of practices that transformed consciousness, of states in which the divine presence became as immediate and undeniable as physical sensation. Initially, Al-Ghazali approached Sufism the same way he had approached the other paths, as an intellectual problem to be analyzed from the outside. He read Sufi texts. He interviewed Sufi practitioners. He tried to understand their methods and evaluate their claims using the same analytical tools he had used for theology and philosophy. But he quickly realized that Sufism could not be understood this way. The Sufis insisted that their knowledge was experiential rather than conceptual. It could not be grasped through study alone. It required practice, transformation, the systematic purification of consciousness through disciplines that most people avoided because they seemed too demanding or uncertain in their outcomes. They used an analogy. Someone who has never tasted honey cannot understand descriptions of sweetness, no matter how precise the language. You can define sweetness chemically. You can describe its effects. But understanding what sweetness is requires tasting it yourself. Similarly, the Sufis argued, someone who has not undergone spiritual transformation cannot understand mystical knowledge through reading about it. You must walk the path. You must do the practices. You must submit to the discipline and see what it reveals. This created a dilemma for Al-Ghazali. His method had been to examine each path from a position of intellectual detachment, to evaluate its claims objectively before committing to it. But Sufism demanded commitment before understanding. It required that he abandon the safety of analytical distance and risk himself in a process whose outcomes he could not predict or control. And this is where the story turns, because what Al-Ghazali did next was an act of remarkable intellectual courage and profound desperation. In November of 1095, at the height of his career, earning enormous prestige and wealth as the most famous professor in Islam, he walked away from it all. He distributed his possessions. He left his position. He left his family temporarily. He became a wandering seeker, practicing the disciplines the Sufis prescribed: prayer, meditation, fasting, renunciation of worldly attachment, the systematic purification of consciousness from spiritual diseases like pride, greed, and the need for recognition. This was not the decision of a man running from intellectual challenges. It was the decision of a thinker so committed to finding truth that he was willing to risk everything: reputation, security, certainty about his own sanity, in pursuit of knowledge that might not exist. He had examined theology and found it defensive. He had mastered philosophy and found it arrogant. He had investigated esotericism and found it fraudulent. And now he was testing the fourth path with his life, rather than just his mind. What he discovered through this investigation transformed not only his understanding of mystical experience, but his entire conception of what knowledge is and how human consciousness can access truth. But before we can understand what he found, we need to understand what drove him to this point. Because the crisis that began as intellectual doubt had become something deeper. It had become a wound in the soul. The recognition that thinking about truth is not the same as knowing truth, that analyzing life is not the same as living it, that consciousness can become so trapped in its own cleverness that it loses contact with the reality it was trying to understand. Al-Ghazali had spent his entire life building structures of thought, and those structures had collapsed, not because they were poorly built, but because structures of thought cannot bear the weight of the questions that matter most. What is real? How can I know? How should I live? What happens when I die? These are not questions that can be answered through argumentation alone. They require something else. Something that theology hinted at but could not deliver. Something that philosophy dismissed but could not replace. Something that the Ismailists promised but did not possess. And the Sufis claimed that this something, this direct knowledge that transforms rather than merely informs, was available to anyone willing to do the work required to receive it. Al-Ghazali was willing because he had tried everything else, and everything else had failed. Let me tell you what it feels like when certainty crumbles. Not the loss of a single belief, not the adjustment of an opinion, but the total collapse of the ground you thought was solid beneath your feet. Al-Ghazali stood in the ruins of his epistemology and felt his body refuse to cooperate with the performance that his life required. This is important to understand. The crisis was not just intellectual, it was somatic, physical. His throat closed when he tried to lecture. He could not swallow food. His tongue would not shape the words he had spoken thousands of times before, because the body knows what the mind tries to deny. You cannot continue pretending certainty when you have seen through the performance. Al-Ghazali had taught his students the foundations of knowledge. He had shown them how sense perception works, how reason operates, how to distinguish reliable sources from unreliable ones. And now, examining those very foundations with the same rigor he had taught others to use, he found nothing solid. Start with the senses. You trust what you see. The sun rises. Objects have color, weight, texture. The world is out there, external to you, reliably structured in ways your senses report accurately. Except they don't. The straight stick looks bent in water. The distant mountain seems small. The dream feels real until you wake. Your eyes tell you the sun moves across the sky when it is the earth that turns. If your senses can deceive you sometimes, how do you know they are not deceiving you always? How do you know that what you take to be waking reality is not itself a more elaborate dream? How do you know that the entire structure of the external world is not a construction your mind creates, rather than an accurate report of what exists independently? You say, but reason corrects the errors of sense perception. That's why we know the stick is straight even though it looks bent. Yes, reason corrects sense, but what corrects reason? Al-Ghazali pushed this question with merciless honesty. Reason operates on principles it cannot prove. The law of non-contradiction, that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect, seems self-evident. But self-evidence is not proof. Mathematical truth seems certain. 2 plus 2 equals 4. The angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees. These conclusions follow necessarily from accepted axioms. But the axioms themselves are not proven by mathematics. They are assumptions that make mathematics possible. And if the axioms are merely conventional, if they reflect the structure of human thought rather than the structure of reality itself, then mathematical certainty is circular. It proves what follows from its assumptions, but it cannot prove that its assumptions correspond to anything real. What if there is a faculty beyond reason, some higher mode of knowing that would reveal reason's errors? the way reason reveals the errors of sense perception. What if the principles you take to be self-evident are just the limitations of human cognitive architecture rather than truths about the fundamental nature of existence? This is not skepticism for the sake of argument. This is the genuine recognition that you do not know and cannot know through reason alone, whether your rational faculties connect you to reality or imprison you in structures of thought that have no correspondence to what lies beyond them. And if you cannot trust your senses and you cannot prove that reason is reliable, then what can you know with certainty? Al-Ghazali felt this question in his body. The paralysis was not psychological weakness. It was epistemological honesty manifesting as physical symptom. His body would not let him continue performing certainty that his mind recognized as performance. Most people never reach this point. They accept inherited frameworks without examining the foundations. They repeat what they were taught and call it knowledge. They live within structures of meaning that feel solid because they have never tested whether those structures can bear weight. But some people cannot avoid the examination. Some minds are built such that once the question arises, how do I know that I know? It cannot be silenced by convenient answers or social pressure to conform. For these people, the crisis is inevitable, and it is devastating, because life requires action, and action requires commitment to some framework of meaning. But if you have seen through all frameworks, if you have recognized that every structure of knowledge rests on unprovable assumptions, then how can you commit to anything? This is what philosophers call the problem of the criterion. To know whether a belief is true, you need a criterion for truth. But to trust the criterion, you need to know that it is the right criterion, which requires another criterion to evaluate the first criterion, which leads to infinite regress or circular reasoning. Al-Ghazali discovered this problem not as abstract puzzle, but as lived impossibility. He could not teach because he did not know what he was teaching. He could not eat because his body refused nourishment for a life built on foundations he recognized as sand. He had reached the endpoint of rational investigation, the recognition that reason cannot prove its own reliability without assuming what it is trying to prove. And here is where most skepticism stops. The skeptic says, since we cannot know anything with absolute certainty, we should suspend judgment and live with uncertainty. But Al-Ghazali knew this answer was inadequate, because human life cannot be lived in pure suspension of judgment. You have to choose whether to eat or fast, to speak or remain silent, to trust this person or that teaching. Even the decision to suspend judgment is itself a judgment that requires justification. Moreover, complete skepticism about knowledge includes skepticism about skepticism itself. If you cannot know anything, you cannot know that you cannot know anything. The skeptical position undermines itself, so you're left with a crisis that reason alone cannot resolve. You need certainty to live. But reason cannot provide certainty about its own foundations. And if reason cannot establish its own reliability, then no conclusions reached through reason can be trusted absolutely. This was Al-Ghazali's wound. Not doubt about particular beliefs, but doubt about the possibility of knowledge itself. Not uncertainty about specific questions, but uncertainty about whether consciousness is capable of grasping truth at all. And wounds of this kind do not heal through more thinking. They heal through transformation. What happened next in Al-Ghazali's story was not a better argument. It was not a philosophical breakthrough that solved the problem of the criterion through cleverer reasoning. It was something else entirely. He describes it as a light that God cast into his heart, an illumination that came not from his own effort, but as gift, as grace, as breakthrough from a reality beyond the mind's self-enclosed circle of doubt. This was not the rejection of reason. It was the discovery of a foundation that makes reason possible and meaningful, a certainty that does not depend on proof, because it is more immediate than any proof could be. But before we can understand what this certainty was and how Al-Ghazali accessed it, we need to understand what it was not. It was not the naive faith that believes without questioning. Al-Ghazali had questioned everything. He had examined every foundation and found them all wanting. His certainty, when it came, would not be the certainty of someone who had never doubted. It was not the intellectual certainty that comes from mastering arguments. Al-Ghazali had mastered every argument available in his intellectual world, and he had discovered that arguments are structures built on assumptions that cannot be argued for without circularity. It was not the esoteric certainty that comes from initiation into secret teachings. Al-Ghazali had investigated that path and found it fraudulent. The certainty he discovered was something different, something that could survive honest doubt because it was not based on proof, something that could answer the deepest questions because it came from a depth that thinking cannot reach. And to find this certainty, Al-Ghazali had to stop thinking his way toward truth and start practicing his way into it. He had to become a Sufi, not in the sense of adopting Sufi beliefs, but in the sense of doing what Sufis do, the systematic transformation of consciousness through disciplines that purify the heart and open it to knowledge that thinking alone cannot access. This is where intellectual courage becomes spiritual courage, because Al-Ghazali was a man whose entire identity was built on his intellectual mastery. He was the most celebrated scholar in Islam. His mind was his instrument, his weapon, his source of meaning and status. And now he had to risk that identity entirely. He had to walk away from everything he had built and submit himself to a process whose outcomes he could not predict or control. Most people, when they reach the edge of what thinking can accomplish, pull back. They accept convenient answers. They suppress the questions that have no answers. They return to inherited frameworks and call it wisdom. Al-Ghazali did the opposite. He walked into the unknowing. He let the foundations crumble completely. He gave up the security of intellectual mastery for the uncertainty of spiritual transformation. And what he found there, in the ruins of his certainty, in the emptiness where his knowledge used to be, was the beginning of something new. Not a return to naive belief, not a philosophical solution to the problem of knowledge, but a way of knowing that includes doubt, that passes through skepticism, that acknowledges reason's limits while discovering capacities in consciousness that reason alone cannot explain. This is the journey we are tracing, from the architecture of doubt to the light that breaks through when architecture collapses. From the crisis of certainty to a certainty of a different kind entirely. But to understand what Al-Ghazali discovered, we need to follow him into the practice, into the disciplines that the Sufis prescribed, into the systematic transformation that turns the mind into mirror, capable of reflecting truth that thinking alone cannot grasp. Before Al-Ghazali could become a mystic, he had to destroy philosophy's claim to absolute authority. This is crucial, because in his world, as in ours, there was a widespread assumption that rational inquiry could answer ultimate questions about reality, that if you thought hard enough, analyzed carefully enough, followed logic rigorously enough, you could discover truths about God, the soul, the nature of existence itself. The philosophers of Al-Ghazali's time, the inheritors of Aristotle, systematized by brilliant Islamic thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, had built comprehensive systems that claimed to provide certain knowledge about metaphysical realities. They argued that the universe is eternal, not created in time. They claimed that God knows only universal principles, not particular events. They denied bodily resurrection, insisting that only the soul survives death. And they presented these claims not as speculative opinions, but as demonstrated truths, proven through the same rigorous methods they used in mathematics and logic. Al-Ghazali knew better, because he had mastered philosophy completely. He had studied their arguments until he understood them better than most philosophers did. And then he wrote a book that would shake Islamic intellectual history, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. The title itself is a declaration of war. Incoherence does not mean wrong in the sense of holding mistaken opinions. It means internally contradictory, logically inconsistent, claiming certainty without demonstration. It means that the philosophers had violated their own standards of rigor when they moved from logic and science into metaphysics. Al-Ghazali's method was surgical. He did not reject philosophy entirely. He acknowledged that in mathematics, logic, and natural science, philosophical methods had achieved genuine results. When you prove a geometrical theorem or describe the motions of celestial bodies, you're using reason appropriately within its proper domain. But when you claim that reason alone can determine whether the universe is eternal or created, whether God knows particulars or only universals, whether bodily resurrection is possible or impossible, you have exceeded reason's competence. You are making assertions that cannot be proven through the methods you claim to use. Al-Ghazali identified 20 positions where the philosophers claimed certainty but provided only speculation. And 3 of these positions were so dangerous, he argued, that anyone who held them should be considered an unbeliever. The eternity of the world, the denial of God's knowledge of particulars, and the rejection of bodily resurrection. Why were these 3 so crucial? Because they eliminated any meaningful relationship between God and creation. If the world is eternal rather than created, then God did not choose to create it and cannot alter its fundamental structure. If God does not know particular events, then prayer is futile and moral accountability is impossible. If there is no resurrection, then this life is all there is, and justice will never be fully realized. These are not minor theological quibbles. They strike at the heart of what makes religious faith coherent and human moral effort meaningful. But Al-Ghazali's critique went deeper than defending specific doctrines. He was exposing a fundamental flaw in how the philosophers understood the relationship between reason and reality. Consider their argument for the eternity of the world. The philosophers claimed that the universe has always existed as an eternal emanation from God. Their reasoning went like this: God is perfect and unchanging. Therefore, God's creative activity must also be perfect and unchanging. Therefore, the universe must be eternal. Because if God created it at a particular moment in time, that would imply changing God, a decision to create that was not operative before. Al-Ghazali showed that this argument is based on confused assumptions about what divine perfection means. The philosophers assumed that changing God would indicate imperfection, but they confused change that results from external compulsion or internal need with free action that expresses divine will. When God creates the universe at a particular moment, this does not indicate imperfection any more than a teacher's decision to begin a lesson at a particular time indicates that the teacher was incomplete before the lesson began. The creation of the world in time expresses divine freedom and wisdom. It does not compromise divine perfection, and the philosopher's assumption that it does reveals that they are imposing human categories of thought onto divine reality rather than following evidence to its conclusion. Similarly, their denial of God's knowledge of particulars was based on the assumption that knowing changing things would make God subject to change. But Al-Ghazali argued that divine knowledge is not like human knowledge. God does not learn new information when events occur. God knows all events, past, present, future, in a single eternal act of knowing that does not change when temporal events unfold. The philosophers could not conceive of this kind of knowledge because they were trying to understand divine knowing by analogy with human knowing. But God's knowledge, like God's existence, is fundamentally different from anything in our experience, and the attempt to constrain divine knowledge within categories derived from human cognition is philosophical arrogance, not rigorous reasoning. But Al-Ghazali's most revolutionary contribution came in his analysis of causation. The philosophers claimed that there are necessary connections between causes and effects in nature. Fire necessarily causes burning, the sun necessarily causes warming, gravity necessarily causes falling. These connections are built into the structure of reality itself, and God cannot violate them without contradicting the divine wisdom that established them. Al-Ghazali asked, "How do you know these connections are necessary? You observe fire touching cotton and the cotton burning. You observe this repeatedly. You infer a necessary connection. But all you actually observe is one event following another. The necessity you attribute to the connection is not observed, it is inferred. And inference from repeated observation can never establish necessity, because the future may not resemble the past, because the unobserved may differ from the observed, because logical necessity cannot be derived from empirical regularity." This argument would later influence European philosophers like Hume, who used similar reasoning to challenge assumptions about causation. But Al-Ghazali was not simply being skeptical about natural regularities. He was proposing an alternative understanding of how the world operates. He argued for what later became known as occasionalism, the view that God is the only genuine cause of all events. What we interpret as natural causation is actually God's habitual way of creating events in regular sequences that appear to us as cause and effect. Fire does not cause burning. God creates burning when fire touches combustible material, and God creates this sequence so regularly that we come to expect it and call it a law of nature. But God remains free to create different outcomes when divine wisdom requires it. This is what makes miracles possible. Not violations of natural law, but God acting differently than the usual pattern when such action serves a higher purpose. This view preserves both the regularity that makes science possible and the divine freedom that makes revelation meaningful. Natural processes follow predictable patterns because God typically acts consistently. But these patterns are descriptions of divine habit, not constraints on divine power. The philosophers had made nature autonomous, governed by laws that even God must respect. Al-Ghazali returned all causation to its source, showing that nature has no power of its own, but operates entirely through divine creative activity maintained at every moment. This metaphysical move had profound implications for how knowledge works. If the philosophers were right, if nature operates through necessary causal connections, independent of divine will, then reason could discover truth about nature by discovering these necessary connections. Philosophy would be the highest science, capable of reaching conclusions that even revelation could not contradict. But if Al-Ghazali was right, if all events occur through divine creative activity that reason cannot fully penetrate, then philosophy's authority is limited. Reason can discover the patterns God typically follows, but it cannot determine what God must do or cannot do. It cannot replace revelation with rational speculation. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is precision about what different methods can accomplish. Reason is excellent for mathematics, logic, analyzing arguments, discovering empirical patterns, but reason cannot prove metaphysical claims about ultimate reality with the same certainty it achieves in formal systems. The philosophers had overreached. They had claimed demonstrative certainty for conclusions that were actually speculative opinions based on unproven assumptions, and they had subordinated revelation to philosophy, as if human reason could correct divine disclosure. Al-Ghazali's Incoherence shattered this pretension. It showed that when philosophers moved beyond their proper domain, they became poets rather than scientists, constructing imaginative systems that pleased their intellects but lacked the rigor they claimed to follow. This did not mean abandoning reason. It meant recognizing reason's limits and remaining open to sources of knowledge that transcend rational demonstration while remaining compatible with sound rational conclusions. And this is what prepared Al-Ghazali for the Sufi path, because Sufism claimed access to a kind of knowledge that reason cannot achieve through its own efforts. Not irrational knowledge, but knowledge that includes and transcends reason. Not anti-philosophical knowledge, but knowledge that begins where philosophy ends. The mystics did not claim to prove their insights through argument. They claimed to experience realities that thinking about cannot substitute for. And Al-Ghazali, having shown that philosophy cannot deliver the certainty it promises, was finally ready to test whether mystical experience could provide what rational argument could not. But this required a transformation more radical than anything he had attempted before. It required that he stop being a professor and become a practitioner. Stop analyzing and start practicing. Stop thinking about truth and start submitting to disciplines that might transform him into someone capable of knowing truth directly. This is where courage becomes spiritual rather than merely intellectual, because Al-Ghazali had built his entire identity on his mind, and now he had to risk that identity completely. You cannot think your way to God. This is what the Sufis knew, and what Al-Ghazali had to learn by abandoning everything he had built through thinking. In November of 1095, at 37 years old, at the peak of his intellectual prestige, commanding wealth and status beyond what most scholars could imagine, Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali walked away. He distributed his money. He left his teaching position. He told his family he was going on pilgrimage. And then he disappeared into the life of a wandering ascetic, practicing disciplines that had nothing to do with brilliance and everything to do with surrender. This was not retreat. It was entry into a different kind of rigor, because what the Sufis understood, what Al-Ghazali had to discover through his own body, was that intellectual knowledge and transformative knowledge are not the same thing. You can study maps of a country you have never visited. You can memorize its geography, learn its history, analyze its culture, but this is not the same as going there, living there, becoming shaped by its climate and customs and rhythms. Similarly, you can study theology, master philosophy, analyze mystical texts. But this does not give you the knowledge the mystics possess. Because their knowledge is not conceptual, it is experiential, it is the knowledge that comes from transformation rather than from thinking about transformation. The Sufis used a simple analogy. Someone who has never tasted honey cannot understand sweetness through descriptions alone. You can define sweetness chemically. You can describe its effects on the tongue. You can compare it to other flavors. But none of this is the same as tasting honey yourself. Understanding what sweetness is requires direct experience, not as a supplement to conceptual knowledge, but as a completely different kind of knowing. Al-Ghazali had spent his life accumulating conceptual knowledge. He had become one of the most learned men in the Islamic world. But the crisis of certainty had shown him that this knowledge could not answer the questions that mattered most. How do I know God exists? And if God exists, how do I know God in a way that transforms how I live, rather than just what I believe about divine attributes? These questions cannot be answered through argument. They require a different faculty entirely. What the Sufis called the spiritual heart. The heart is not the physical organ that pumps blood. It is the center of consciousness where knowledge becomes intimate rather than abstract, where truth is not believed but experienced, where transformation occurs. And like any faculty, the heart can be healthy or diseased, clear or clouded, functional or dysfunctional. Most people live with diseased hearts, not because they are morally evil, but because consciousness accumulates layers of distortion that prevent it from functioning as it was designed to function. Pride clouds the heart. You become so attached to your own opinions that you cannot receive truth from sources beyond yourself. Greed distorts perception. You see everything through the lens of what you can acquire, rather than what things actually are. Envy corrupts relationship. You measure yourself against others constantly, which makes genuine connection impossible. These are not moral failings in the sense of breaking rules. They are spiritual diseases in the sense of faculties operating incorrectly. And like physical diseases, spiritual diseases do not heal through wishing they would go away. They require systematic treatment. This is what the Sufi path provides, a discipline for healing the heart so it can function as the organ of direct spiritual perception it was created to be. Al-Ghazali learned the practices. Prayer performed not mechanically, but with full awareness of standing before the divine presence. Meditation that stilled the constant movement of thought and created space for something other than thinking. Fasting that broke the body's habitual demands and revealed that consciousness does not require constant gratification to exist. Remembrance of death that put all worldly concerns in perspective and revealed what actually matters. But more than specific practices, he learned a way of being in the world that was completely foreign to the intellectual life he had lived. He learned to observe his own consciousness without identifying with its contents, to notice when pride arose and recognize it as a cloud passing through awareness rather than as his true self, to catch himself performing virtue for recognition and to let that performance drop away, to distinguish between the ego's need for status and the soul's hunger for truth. This is what the Sufis called purification. Not moral perfection in the sense of never making mistakes, but the systematic removal of distortions that prevent consciousness from perceiving reality clearly. And as the heart purifies, something begins to happen. Knowledge that was conceptual becomes experiential. Beliefs about God's mercy become recognition of mercy as the fundamental texture of reality. Understanding that you depend on divine grace becomes felt awareness of absolute dependence at every moment. This is not philosophical argument reaching a conclusion. It is consciousness awakening to what has always been true, but was hidden by the noise of self-concern and intellectual performance. Al-Ghazali describes his own awakening carefully. He does not claim to have achieved perfect mystical union with God. He does not present himself as a saint whose consciousness has been entirely transformed. What he describes is simpler and more honest. He says that through Sufi practice, he came to certainty about truths he had previously accepted on authority or proven through argument. The certainty was different. Not intellectual but experiential. Not mediated through reasoning but immediate. He knew God exists the way you know you exist. Not because you can prove it, but because the awareness is more fundamental than any proof could be. He knew divine mercy the way you know warmth when you stand in sunlight, not as concept but as presence. This knowledge did not eliminate doubt entirely. Al-Ghazali remained aware that reason could generate skeptical questions, but the questions no longer had power over him, because he had touched something deeper than question and answer. He had experienced a certainty that skepticism could not reach, because it was not based on proof. This is what mystical knowledge means. Not irrational belief, but knowledge that comes through faculties that thinking alone cannot access. Not anti-intellectual insight, but trans-intellectual. It includes reason, passes through reason's questions, and arrives at awareness that reason points toward but cannot generate through its own effort. And crucially, this knowledge was transformative in a way that intellectual knowledge never was. When you prove God's existence through philosophical argument, this does not necessarily change how you live. You can affirm all the right theological propositions while remaining essentially untransformed in character and consciousness. But when you know God through direct spiritual experience, when divine presence becomes as immediate as the presence of your own existence, this knowledge cannot remain merely theoretical. It reorganizes your entire way of being in the world. What you wanted changes, how you perceive others changes. Your relationship to success and failure, pleasure and pain, life and death, all of it shifts when consciousness touches the reality behind appearances. Al-Ghazali spent 11 years in this condition, not in constant retreat from the world, but in alternation between periods of intensive practice and periods of engagement with ordinary life, teaching sometimes, traveling, writing, but always from a center that had been relocated from intellectual mastery to something quieter and more fundamental. And gradually he understood what had happened to him. The skeptical crisis had not been an intellectual failure, it had been the beginning of transformation. Doubt had dissolved the false certainties he had built through thinking, creating space for a different kind of knowing to emerge. The paralysis that prevented him from teaching had not been weakness. It had been his consciousness refusing to continue performing knowledge it did not possess, forcing him toward a more honest relationship with truth. The collapse of philosophical certainty had not destroyed his capacity for knowledge. It had revealed that knowledge has dimensions reason cannot access through argument alone. And the Sufi practices did not give him new information about God. They transformed him into someone capable of knowing God directly rather than through concepts. This is the pattern Al-Ghazali discovered and would spend the rest of his life teaching. Transformation precedes understanding. You do not figure out spiritual truth through thinking harder. You become capable of perceiving spiritual truth by becoming a different kind of person. The purification of the heart is not preparation for knowledge. It is the knowledge, because when the heart is clear, reality reveals itself, not as argument to be evaluated, but as presence to be experienced. And this presence, this direct awareness of divine reality, operating in and through all existence, is what the philosophers could not reach through speculation, what the theologians could not defend. Through argumentation, what the Ismailis could not transmit through secret teachings. It can only be known by those willing to be transformed, and transformation requires surrender, letting go of the need to control truth through thinking, accepting that the most important knowledge comes as gift rather than achievement. This is what Al-Ghazali learned in the ruins of his certainty, and it is what he returned to teach. Al-Ghazali returned to the world carrying something he had not possessed before. Not new arguments, not better proofs, not secret teachings that could be transmitted through words alone. What he carried was integration. The hard-won synthesis of everything he had learned through thinking and everything he had discovered by ceasing to think. He had examined theology and found it defensive but necessary. He had mastered philosophy and found it brilliant but limited. He had tested Ismailism and found it fraudulent, and he had practiced Sufism and found it transformative, but in need of systematic articulation. Now, he understood that these were not competing paths, but complementary dimensions of a single journey toward truth. Theology protects revealed wisdom from being dismissed by those who have not experienced what it describes. Philosophy trains the mind in rigor and clarity that prevents spiritual experience from becoming confused with emotional enthusiasm or psychological projection. And Sufism provides the transformative practice that makes theological claims real and philosophical insights lived, rather than merely believed. The question was not which path to choose. The question was how to integrate them without betraying the unique contribution each makes to human understanding. This is what Al-Ghazali spent the rest of his life doing, and the result was a work so comprehensive, so ambitious in scope, that it would reshape Islamic intellectual and spiritual life for the next 1,000 years. Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. 40 books organized into 4 major sections, each containing 10 books exploring different aspects of what it means to be fully human in relationship to ultimate reality. But to call this a work of religious instruction misses what makes it revolutionary. Al-Ghazali was not writing a manual for ritual observance or a defense of orthodox doctrine. He was creating a complete map of human transformation, showing how every aspect of ordinary existence can become a vehicle for spiritual awakening. The first quarter deals with acts of worship, but Al-Ghazali shows that worship is not mechanical performance of prescribed rituals. It is the systematic training of consciousness in awareness, humility, gratitude, and surrender. Prayer is not recitation. It is the practice of standing consciously before divine presence, recognizing your absolute dependence at every moment, aligning your will with wisdom beyond your understanding. Fasting is not temporary deprivation. It is breaking the tyranny of habitual desire, discovering that consciousness does not require constant gratification, learning to distinguish genuine need from compulsive wanting. Charity is not moral obligation. It is the purification of the heart from attachment to material security, the recognition that everything you possess is gift rather than achievement, the practice of generosity as spiritual medicine. For greed, every ritual becomes psychology, every practice becomes transformation. Nothing is merely external. The second quarter examines social customs and daily life. How you eat, how you speak, how you conduct business, how you relate to family and neighbors. All of it matters because consciousness does not exist in isolation from the world. You cannot purify your heart in meditation and then act with cruelty in the marketplace. You cannot cultivate humility in prayer and then dominate others in conversation. Spiritual practice that does not transform how you live is performance, not realization. Al-Ghazali shows how marriage can become spiritual discipline, how raising children teaches you about divine patience and mercy, how economic activity can serve higher purposes than accumulation, how every relationship offers opportunities for developing qualities that the heart needs if it is to become capable of perceiving ultimate truth. But the genius of the revival emerges fully in the third quarter, where Al-Ghazali systematically examines the spiritual diseases that prevent the heart from functioning as it was created to function. Pride, envy, anger, greed, lust, vanity, hypocrisy, self-deception, These are not moral failures in the sense of breaking rules. They are psychological distortions that corrupt perception, distort relationship, and prevent consciousness from accessing the knowledge it needs to flourish. Al-Ghazali analyzes each disease with devastating precision. He shows how pride disguises itself as confidence, how envy masquerades as justice, how anger pretends to be righteousness, how greed calls itself ambition, and he provides detailed diagnosis of how these diseases develop, how they reinforce each other, how they can be gradually healed through practices that are psychological as much as spiritual. This is not theology. This is depth psychology, written 800 years before Freud. It is the systematic exploration of how consciousness becomes distorted and how it can be restored to health. But Al-Ghazali does not leave you paralyzed by awareness of your diseases. The fourth quarter explores the qualities that lead to spiritual health and ultimately to direct knowledge of divine reality: repentance, patience, gratitude, fear and hope, poverty and renunciation, trust in God, love, intention, truthfulness, self-examination, meditation. Each quality is both practice and destination. You cultivate patience through patient action, and patient action gradually transforms you into someone whose natural response is patience rather than reactivity. You practice gratitude by noticing gifts you have been taking for granted, and this noticing opens your awareness until gratitude becomes the fundamental texture of how you experience existence. You develop love of God by contemplating divine attributes and recognizing them manifest in creation, and this contemplation gradually transforms mere belief into direct experiential knowledge. The revival is a manual for transformation, but it is also an integration of everything Al-Ghazali had learned through his crisis and his healing. From theology, he retained the framework of revealed truth that provides guidance reason alone cannot generate. From philosophy, he kept the commitment to rigor and clarity that prevents spiritual claims from becoming vague emotionalism. From his critique of philosophy, he maintained the recognition that reason has limits and must remain humble about what it can accomplish. And from Sufism, he incorporated the transformative practices that make theoretical knowledge become lived reality. This is what integration means: not choosing one path and rejecting the others, not creating a vague synthesis that honors all approaches by diluting them, but recognizing the unique contribution each makes and showing how they work together when properly understood. Reason prepares the ground. It clears away false beliefs, analyzes arguments, establishes what can and cannot be known through thinking alone. But reason alone cannot transform consciousness or provide direct knowledge of ultimate reality. Revelation provides the framework. It describes realities that reason can point toward but not prove, that experience confirms but thinking cannot generate. It offers guidance about how to live in ways that serve transformation rather than obstruct it. Practice does the work. The systematic disciplines that purify the heart, that train consciousness in awareness, that gradually remove the distortions preventing direct perception of truth. And experience confirms what revelation describes and practice makes possible: the direct knowledge of divine reality that is more certain than any proof, because it is more immediate than thinking. This is the pattern Al-Ghazali discovered and encoded in the revival, and it is why the work remains relevant nearly 1,000 years after it was written, because the structure of human consciousness has not changed. The diseases that corrupt the heart are the same now as they were in 11th century Baghdad. The need for certainty, for meaning, for transformation, these hungers are permanent features of what it means to be human, and the path Al-Ghazali mapped remains valid, not because he discovered something that no one else has known, but because he articulated with unprecedented clarity and comprehensiveness what the great spiritual traditions have always taught: that transformation is possible, that human consciousness can access knowledge beyond what thinking provides, that life can be organized in ways that serve awakening rather than obstruct it. But this knowledge is not theoretical. It cannot be transmitted through reading alone. It requires practice. The systematic work of examining your own consciousness, recognizing your diseases, cultivating healthier patterns, submitting to disciplines that purify the heart and open it to reality's thinking, cannot reach. Al-Ghazali wrote the revival for people who were willing to do this work, not for scholars who wanted to debate epistemology, but for practitioners who wanted to become capable of knowing truth directly. And the book's enduring power comes from the fact that it speaks to the part of you that knows, even if you cannot articulate how you know, that there is more to reality than what your senses report, and more to knowledge than what thinking can grasp. The part of you that hungers for certainty but has learned that arguments do not satisfy this hunger. The part of you that longs for transformation but does not know how to begin. The part of you that suspects your consciousness is diseased but needs someone to name the diseases precisely enough that you can recognize them and start the work of healing. This is what the revival offers, not answers that you can believe without changing, but a map of transformation that shows you where you are, where the path leads, and what the journey requires. And the central message, repeated throughout 40 books, explored from every angle, applied to every aspect of human life, is simple. You cannot think your way to truth. You must become capable of knowing truth through transformation. And transformation requires surrender, practice, patience, and grace. There is a rust that forms on mirrors when they are not cleaned. Not visible damage, not obvious corruption, just a gradual accumulation of film that makes reflection less clear until finally the mirror shows nothing accurately. Al-Ghazali understood that human consciousness works this way. The heart is designed to be a mirror reflecting truth, but it accumulates layers of distortion, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually through patterns of thought and action that seem harmless but corrupt perception. These distortions are what he called spiritual diseases, and understanding them is not optional if you want to know truth, because a diseased heart cannot perceive reality clearly, no matter how brilliant the mind or how sophisticated the arguments. Pride is the first disease, and perhaps the most dangerous because it corrupts the very faculty that should recognize disease and seek healing. Pride is not confidence. It is not healthy self-respect or appropriate recognition of your abilities. Pride is the inflation of ego that makes you measure yourself constantly against others, that needs to be superior, that cannot bear to be corrected or guided or shown that you are wrong. The proud person becomes unteachable. Because teaching requires humility, the recognition that you do not know and need to learn. But pride insists that you already know, that your understanding is sufficient, that others should listen to you rather than you listening to them. And this makes transformation impossible, because transformation requires admitting that your current state is inadequate, that you need to change, that someone or something beyond yourself knows better than you do. Al-Ghazali shows how pride disguises itself in apparently virtuous forms. The scholar who takes pride in learning, the mystic who becomes attached to spiritual experiences, the moral reformer who becomes self-righteous about ethical commitments. In each case, something good, knowledge, spiritual practice, moral concern, becomes corrupted when it feeds the ego's need for superiority rather than serving truth. The cure for pride is systematic practice of humility, not false modesty that pretends you have no abilities, but honest recognition that whatever you know or can do comes as gift rather than personal achievement, that you depend absolutely on sources of knowledge and power beyond your control, that consciousness itself is something you receive rather than something you create. Contemplation of death helps, because death reveals that all your achievements are temporary, that everything you have accumulated will be taken from you, that the ground you stand on is less solid than pride assumes. Service to those who cannot reciprocate helps, because it breaks the transactional pattern where you give only when you expect return. It trains you in generosity that serves others rather than feeding your need for recognition. But most importantly, self-examination helps, the practice of observing your own mind and noticing when pride arises, catching yourself performing virtue for recognition, recognizing when you resist correction, not because the correction is wrong, but because accepting it would wound your ego. This noticing is not judgment, it is precision. You are learning to distinguish between healthy confidence and diseased pride. between genuine knowledge and the performance of knowing, between service to truth and service to ego. Envy is the second major disease, and it is perhaps the most self-destructive because it makes you suffer from the good fortune of others. The envious person cannot be happy for someone else's success. They experience another's achievement as their own failure. They measure themselves constantly against others and find themselves lacking, and this comparative thinking poisons relationship and distorts perception. Al-Ghazali shows that envy reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how reality works. You assume that good is a limited resource, that someone else's blessing means less available for you. But this treats divine generosity as if it were finite wealth to be rationed carefully. In reality, the success of others can inspire you, teach you, show you what is possible. Their gifts do not diminish yours. Their achievements do not prevent your flourishing. But envy cannot see this. It is trapped in zero-sum thinking, where every winner requires a loser. Every blessing to another feels like theft from you. The cure is cultivating what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual magnanimity, the capacity to rejoice genuinely in others' good fortune. This is not performed cheerfulness while feeling resentment underneath. It is the actual transformation of consciousness, such that their joy becomes your joy. This transformation happens through expanding awareness beyond narrow self-interest. When you recognize that you're not a separate ego competing against other egos, but consciousness participating in a larger reality, then the boundary between self and other becomes less rigid. Their flourishing is not opposed to yours. It is part of the same field of possibility you inhabit. And recognizing this makes envy literally impossible. Anger is the third disease, and it is complicated because anger can serve justice or destroy peace depending on its source and expression. There is righteous anger at injustice that motivates necessary action, and there is destructive anger that lashes out from wounded ego and makes situations worse. Al-Ghazali teaches discrimination. You learn to feel the difference between anger that serves truth and anger that serves pride, between anger that protects the vulnerable and anger that punishes those who have wounded your ego. Righteous anger is clear, focused, proportional. It arises in response to genuine harm and seeks appropriate remedy. It does not escalate beyond what the situation requires. It does not continue after justice has been served. Destructive anger is reactive, disproportionate, ongoing. It feeds on itself. It seeks revenge rather than justice. It wants to dominate rather than protect. The transformation of anger requires developing what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual strength, the capacity to respond wisely rather than react emotionally. This is not suppression of feeling. It is the channeling of emotional energy in service of higher purposes. You feel anger at injustice, but you do not let anger control your response. You act decisively to address wrong, while remaining clear about what will actually help, rather than just venting your rage. This requires practice, noticing when anger arises, pausing before acting on it, asking whether this anger serves truth or ego, choosing response rather than reaction. Greed is the fourth disease, the insatiable hunger for more wealth, more possessions, more security, that can never be satisfied because it is trying to meet spiritual needs through material means. Al-Ghazali shows that greed is not appreciation for good things. It is not wanting enough to meet legitimate needs. Greed is the attempt to find ultimate security and satisfaction through accumulation. But this attempt is doomed, because no amount of wealth can provide the security you seek. Death will take it all. Circumstances will change. The things you own will decay or be lost, and even while you possess them, they do not satisfy the hunger that drives acquisition, because that hunger is spiritual. It is the soul's longing for something permanent, something that cannot be lost, something that provides genuine rather than illusory security. The cure is what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual poverty, not literal destitution, but the recognition that you depend absolutely on sources beyond your control, and that trying to secure yourself through accumulation is futile. This recognition frees you to use material goods appropriately without being enslaved by them. You have enough for your needs, you share generously, but you do not base your security or identity on what you own. And gradually, as this practice deepens, you discover that the security you were seeking through accumulation was available all along through surrender, trusting that you will be provided for, recognizing that your existence itself is gift rather than achievement. These four diseases, pride, envy, anger, greed, are not the only distortions that corrupt the heart, but they are primary, and they generate countless other problems that prevent consciousness from functioning clearly. What makes Al-Ghazali's analysis so powerful is that he treats these not as moral failings to be condemned, but as diseases to be healed. You are not evil for experiencing pride or envy. You are sick, and sickness requires treatment, not punishment. The treatment is systematic practice, not trying harder to be good, but engaging in disciplines that gradually transform how consciousness operates. Self-examination shows you the diseases. Humility practices cure pride. Gratitude practices cure envy. Meditation practices create space between feeling and reaction. Generosity practices cure greed. And slowly, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually through sustained practice, the heart begins to clear, the mirror begins to reflect more accurately, and as it clears, you become capable of perceiving realities that the diseased heart could not see. This is not moral improvement in the sense of becoming a better person according to social standards. This is the restoration of consciousness to its proper function, the healing that makes knowledge possible. Because Al-Ghazali understood what most people miss, you cannot perceive truth clearly through a distorted instrument. And consciousness, when diseased, is distorted. It sees everything through the lens of ego concern, comparative thinking, reactive emotion, grasping desire. The purification of the heart is not preparation for knowledge, it is the knowledge. Because when the heart is clear, reality reveals itself, not as something you figure out through thinking, but as something you perceive directly because the distortions have been removed. This is why spiritual practice is necessary, not to earn divine favor, not to become morally superior, but to become capable of knowing what is already present, but hidden by the diseases you have been carrying. Near the end of his life, Al-Ghazali wrote a text that would become one of the most mysterious and profound works in Islamic intellectual history. Mishkat al-Anwar, the Niche of Lights. The title comes from a verse in the Quran describing divine reality as light upon light, manifest through layers of illumination that range from physical radiance to spiritual awareness, to the pure consciousness of ultimate reality itself. And Al-Ghazali uses this image, light, to explore the deepest questions about the relationship between human consciousness and divine truth. Light is the perfect metaphor for knowledge, because just as physical light makes visible what was hidden in darkness, spiritual light makes knowable what was hidden from unilluminated consciousness. And just as there are different intensities and qualities of physical light, the dim glow of a candle, the steady illumination of a lamp, the blazing radiance of the sun, there are different levels of spiritual illumination corresponding to different modes of knowing. Al-Ghazali identifies three fundamental levels of reality, each requiring a different kind of light to be perceived. The first level is the world of physical objects and sensory experience. This is the realm most people take to be the whole of reality. Trees, stones, bodies, the movements of planets, the processes of nature. This level can be investigated through empirical observation and rational analysis. The light that illuminates it is the natural capacity of human reason working with sense perception, and within its proper domain, this light is reliable. You can discover mathematical relationships, logical principles, empirical regularities. Science operates effectively at this level, but Al-Ghazali shows that this level, however important for practical life, is the least real of the three. It is like shadows cast by more fundamental realities. Someone who mistakes shadows for the things casting them remains trapped in illusion. Most people live this way. They see the physical world and assume this is all there is. They measure reality by what can be weighed and touched. They reduce consciousness to brain states and meaning to evolutionary adaptation, and they miss everything that matters most. The second level consists of rational concepts, logical relationships, mathematical truths. This is the realm that philosophers explore when they investigate questions about substance and accident, cause and effect, universal and particular. The light that illuminates this level is the higher intellectual faculty that can grasp abstract relationships and logical principles. This is what distinguishes human consciousness from animal consciousness: the capacity for conceptual thought, for recognizing patterns, for understanding principles that apply across different particular cases. Al-Ghazali acknowledges the value of this kind of knowledge. Mathematics and logic reveal truths that are certain and universal. Philosophical analysis can clarify concepts and expose fallacious reasoning. But he also shows that this level has fundamental limitations. Rational knowledge remains external to the knower. Even when you understand logically that God exists and has certain attributes, this knowledge does not transform you. It does not provide the direct experience that changes how you live. Moreover, reason operating alone cannot reach ultimate truth. It can point toward realities beyond itself. It can prepare consciousness for illumination, but it cannot generate the direct knowledge that transcends conceptual mediation. The third level is the realm of pure spiritual reality. This is what the mystics access through transformed consciousness. Not concepts about God, but direct awareness of divine presence. Not beliefs about ultimate truth, but immediate participation in reality as it actually is. The light that illuminates this level is not produced by human effort alone. It is divine self-disclosure, the light of God making itself known to consciousness that has been prepared to receive it. And this light does not add new information to what you already know. It transforms the knower. It changes your relationship to everything you thought you understood. Prayer is no longer ritual performance. It is standing consciously in the presence of the reality that sustains your existence at every moment. Gratitude is no longer moral duty. It is the spontaneous response to recognizing that everything you experience is gift. Love is no longer emotion. It is consciousness aligned with the fundamental nature of existence itself. This is what Al-Ghazali means by spiritual knowledge. Not mystical experiences that you accumulate like achievements, but transformation of consciousness such that you perceive reality differently than you did before. And crucially, this knowledge does not contradict rational understanding or empirical observation. It includes them, contextualizes them, shows their proper place within a larger framework. The physical world remains real. Science remains valid within its domain. Reason remains necessary for clear thinking. But none of these are ultimate. They are levels of reality and modes of knowing that point towards something they cannot themselves contain. Al-Ghazali uses the metaphor of veils to describe how consciousness accesses deeper levels. Most people are veiled by attachment to the physical world. They see only surfaces and assume this is all there is. Some people penetrate beyond the physical to the rational. They understand concepts, analyze arguments, recognize patterns, but they remain veiled from direct spiritual perception. And a few, through grace and practice, have the veils removed. Not all at once, not completely, but sufficiently that they begin to see reality from the perspective of ultimate truth rather than from the limited standpoint of ego consciousness. This removal of veils is what the Sufis call unveiling or revelation. And it is what Al-Ghazali experienced through his years of practice after the skeptical crisis. The certainty he gained was not new information, it was new seeing. The same realities he had known conceptually through theology and philosophy became immediate, undeniable, transformative. God's existence was no longer a conclusion at the end of an argument. It was as obvious as his own existence, not something that could be doubted because the awareness was more fundamental than doubt. Divine mercy was no longer an attribute listed in theological texts. It was the texture of reality itself, recognizable in everything that happens. His own dependence on divine sustenance was no longer abstract doctrine. It was felt awareness at every moment, the recognition that his consciousness, his breath, his ability to think and act, all depend on sources utterly beyond his control. This is what the niche of lights explores, not as systematic theology, but as poetic meditation on the nature of knowledge and reality, on how consciousness can access truths that thinking cannot prove but experience confirms. And the central teaching is this: reality is structured in layers, consciousness can be trained to perceive these layers, and the deepest knowledge comes not from thinking about ultimate truth, but from becoming capable of recognizing it directly. But this recognition requires purification. The heart must be cleared of the diseases that distort perception. Consciousness must be trained through practice to function as it was designed to function. This is why the niche of lights cannot be separated from the revival. The metaphysics only make sense in the context of the psychology. The theory of knowledge only works when combined with the practices that make knowledge possible. You cannot read about the light and expect to be illuminated. You must remove the veils. And removing veils requires the systematic work of transformation that Al-Ghazali described in the revival. Self-examination to recognize your diseases, purification practices to heal them, devotional disciplines to train consciousness in awareness, meditation to create space for realities beyond thinking, service to break the tyranny of self-concern. All of this is necessary, not as prerequisite to knowledge, but as the knowledge itself. Because transformation is not preparation for seeing. Transformation is seeing. When consciousness clears, reality reveals itself. Not as something new, but as what was always present but hidden by distortion. And this revelation, this direct knowing that the mystics describe and the philosophers cannot reach through speculation, is what makes human life meaningful. It answers the questions that matter most, not through arguments, but through awareness. Who am I? Why do I exist? What is real? How should I live? These are not answered by thinking harder. They are answered by becoming capable of knowing directly, by transforming consciousness until it can perceive truths that were always present but inaccessible to the diseased heart. This is the light Al-Ghazali discovered in the ruins of his certainty. This is what he spent his life teaching. And this is why his work remains luminous nearly 1,000 years later, because the structure of human consciousness has not changed. The path from doubt to certainty through transformation is still valid. The practices still work. The light still breaks through when veils are removed. And you reading this now, carrying your own questions and uncertainties and hungers, you're invited into the same journey. Not to believe what Al-Ghazali believed, but to practice what he practiced and see what you see. How do you know anything? Not in the casual sense of opinion or belief, but in the sense of certainty so complete that doubt cannot touch it. This is the question that drove Al-Ghazali to crisis and eventually to transformation. And his answer, worked out through years of practice and reflection, provides one of the most sophisticated epistemologies in philosophical history. He identifies 4 types of certainty, each appropriate to different domains of knowledge, and each requiring different methods to achieve. The first is immediate certainty, the kind of direct awareness that consciousness has of its own existence and basic operations. You know you exist, not because you can prove it, but because the awareness is more fundamental than any proof could be. Even to doubt your existence presupposes that something is doing the doubting. This is the bedrock, the one thing that skepticism cannot touch, because skepticism itself requires the existence of a skeptical consciousness. But immediate certainty, while absolutely reliable within its domain, is limited. You know you exist, but you do not know through immediate awareness whether your perceptions correspond to external reality, whether your reasoning tracks objective truth, whether your moral intuitions reflect genuine values. These questions require investigation beyond immediate certainty. The second type is demonstrative certainty, the kind achieved through rigorous logical analysis based on clearly established premises. Mathematics provides the clearest examples. 2 + 2 = 4. The angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees. These conclusions follow necessarily from accepted axioms and can be rigorously proven. Demonstrative certainty extends reliable knowledge far beyond immediate awareness. It enables prediction, explanation, the discovery of patterns that were not obvious from direct observation. But Al-Ghazali shows that demonstrative certainty depends on premises that cannot themselves be demonstrated without circularity. Mathematical axioms must be accepted as self-evident if mathematics is to work. Logical principles like non-contradiction must be assumed if logic is to operate. This does not make mathematics unreliable within its domain, but it reveals that even demonstrative certainty rests on foundations that cannot be proven by demonstration. Moreover, when applied to ultimate questions about God, the soul, the nature of reality, demonstrative certainty becomes elusive. Different philosophical schools reach contradictory conclusions using equally rigorous methods, which suggests that metaphysical questions exceed what demonstration can settle. The third type is what Al-Ghazali calls knowledge by authority, the acceptance of claims because they come from sources you trust to know better than you do. Most of what you believe about the world comes this way. You accept that Australia exists, though you may never have visited it. You trust that your heart pumps blood, though you have not examined your own cardiovascular system. You rely on expert testimony about history, science, geography. This is not irrational. It is necessary. Consciousness cannot investigate everything directly. You must rely on others who have knowledge you lack. But authority-based knowledge has obvious limitations. The authorities might be wrong. Different authorities might contradict each other. And even when authorities agree, their agreement does not make you certain in the way that direct experience makes you certain. You believe Australia exists on the testimony of those who have been there, but someone who has visited Australia knows in a way that you do not. And this points toward the fourth type of certainty, the kind that Al-Ghazali discovered through Sufi practice and that transforms his entire epistemology. This is direct experiential knowledge, not mediated through concepts or arguments or testimony, but immediate like the certainty of your own existence, yet extending beyond the self to include awareness of realities that thinking cannot grasp. The mystics describe this as tasting rather than knowing about, and the distinction is crucial. You can read descriptions of honey, learn its chemical composition, understand how sweetness affects taste receptors, but none of this is the same as tasting honey yourself. The experience provides knowledge that concepts cannot substitute for. Similarly, you can study theology, master philosophical arguments about God, memorize sacred texts. But this conceptual knowledge is not the same as direct awareness of divine presence. And the awareness, when it comes, is not vague emotion or subjective feeling that might be dismissed as psychological projection. It has the same quality of certainty that immediate awareness has, undeniable, more fundamental than doubt, transformative of how you perceive everything else. Al-Ghazali is careful to distinguish genuine experiential knowledge from various counterfeit states. Emotional enthusiasm, imaginative fantasy, psychological abnormality, these can produce experiences that seem spiritually significant, but do not provide reliable knowledge. The test is practical consequences. Genuine spiritual knowledge produces increased wisdom, moral excellence, capacity for service, and humility about your achievements. States that lead to spiritual pride, emotional instability, or deterioration of character are not authentic knowledge regardless of how subjectively convincing they feel. This fourfold typology, immediate certainty, demonstrative certainty, knowledge by authority, experiential knowledge, provides Al-Ghazali with a comprehensive framework for understanding how consciousness accesses truth. Each type is valid within its proper domain. Immediate certainty for your own existence, demonstrative certainty for mathematics and logic, authority for much of practical knowledge, experiential certainty for ultimate realities that thinking cannot grasp. The error is not using one type of knowledge. The error is claiming one type can replace the others, or applying a method beyond its appropriate scope. The philosophers erred by claiming demonstrative certainty for metaphysical questions that exceed what demonstration can settle. The Ismailis erred by claiming authority without evidence that their leaders possessed the knowledge they claimed. The theologians erred by thinking conceptual arguments could substitute for transformative experience, but the mystics did not err when they were genuine because they recognized that ultimate knowledge requires transformation. You cannot think your way to knowing God. You must become capable of direct awareness through practices that purify consciousness and open it to realities thinking cannot reach. This is the mechanics of certainty Al-Ghazali discovered, not a formula that anyone can apply mechanically, but a map showing different territories of knowledge and different methods appropriate to each territory. And the crucial insight is this: the most important knowledge of ultimate reality, of what gives life meaning, of how you should live, cannot be achieved through reason alone or authority alone. It requires experience, direct encounter with truth that transforms you rather than just informing you. But this experience is not arbitrary or subjective. It follows patterns. It can be cultivated through practice. It has criteria for distinguishing authentic from counterfeit states. The Sufi path provides the practices: purification of the heart from spiritual diseases, training in awareness through prayer and meditation, breaking attachment through renunciation and service, developing qualities like humility, patience, gratitude that prepare consciousness for illumination. And when consciousness is prepared, through grace more than achievement, illumination comes, not as dramatic mystical experience necessarily, but as quiet certainty about truths that were previously only believed or argued for. God's existence becomes as obvious as your own existence. Divine mercy becomes recognizable in every circumstance. Your absolute dependence on sources beyond yourself becomes felt awareness rather than abstract doctrine. This knowledge does not eliminate doubt entirely. Al-Ghazali remained capable of generating skeptical questions after his transformation, but the questions no longer had power over him because he had touched something deeper than question and answer. He had experienced certainty of a kind that skepticism cannot reach, not because it is irrational, but because it is transrational. It includes reason's questions and arrives at awareness that reason points toward but cannot produce through its own effort. And this is what makes Al-Ghazali's epistemology so important. He shows how to honor the achievements of rational inquiry while recognizing that reason has limits, how to respect the guidance of revelation while insisting that revealed truth must be experienced rather than merely believed, how to integrate different sources of knowledge without reducing them to a single method. The result is an approach to certainty that is both rigorous and humble. Rigorous in demanding evidence, clarity, systematic investigation. Humble in recognizing that ultimate truth exceeds what thinking can grasp and requires transformation of the knower rather than just acquisition of new information. This is the gift Al-Ghazali left, not a system to be believed, but a path to be walked. Not arguments to be memorized, but practices to be engaged. Not certainty handed to you, but certainty discovered through becoming someone capable of knowing what you could not know before. Mystical realization does not remove you from the world. This is crucial to understand, because there is a persistent assumption that spiritual awakening means withdrawal from ordinary life, that the mystic becomes so absorbed in divine contemplation that social responsibilities no longer matter. Al-Ghazali knew better because he lived it. After his years of wandering practice, after experiencing the transformation he had been seeking, he did not remain in permanent retreat. He returned to teaching. He engaged with political concerns. He wrote about family life, economic ethics, social justice, because genuine spiritual knowledge enhances rather than eliminates your capacity to serve constructive purposes in the world. The person whose consciousness has expanded through authentic practice develops greater empathy, not less, deeper wisdom about human nature, not escapist detachment, stronger commitment to justice and welfare of others, not selfish preoccupation with personal spiritual states. This is how you know the transformation is real. It makes you more capable of love, service, patience, wise action, not less. Al-Ghazali shows how spiritual principles apply to every dimension of human social existence, starting with the most intimate relationships and extending outward to encompass economics, politics, community organization. Marriage, in his understanding, is not just a social arrangement or biological partnership. It is a spiritual discipline that creates opportunities for developing qualities the heart needs if it is to become capable of knowing ultimate truth. The challenges of intimate relationship teach you about patience, about forgiveness, about loving someone despite their flaws and irritating habits, about negotiating differences without dominating or being dominated. Raising children teaches you about divine patience and mercy. You watch a small human make the same mistakes repeatedly. You guide without controlling. You provide structure while allowing freedom. You love unconditionally while maintaining boundaries. These are precisely the qualities required for spiritual development. And family life, approached consciously, becomes the training ground for transformation. But Al-Ghazali also recognizes that family relationships can become sources of spiritual stagnation when they are approached with purely conventional motivations or managed according to social expectations rather than spiritual principles. Marriage based primarily on physical attraction or economic advantage may provide temporary satisfaction but cannot produce lasting fulfillment. Parenting focused exclusively on material success or social conformity prepares children for worldly achievement, but not for the deeper challenges of human existence. What he advocates is conscious relationship, approaching intimate partnerships and parental responsibilities as opportunities for mutual spiritual development rather than just sources of personal satisfaction or social obligation. This requires both partners to commit to their own individual transformation and to supporting each other's growth. Even when this creates temporary inconvenience, even when it challenges conventional expectations about how relationships should work. Similarly with economic activity, Al-Ghazali does not romanticize poverty or condemn wealth. He shows how economic life can serve spiritual development when approached with right understanding and intention. Work can be worship when it is motivated by service rather than mere accumulation, when it provides something genuinely useful to others, when it is conducted ethically with respect for all participants, when its fruits are shared generously rather than hoarded compulsively. But economic activity becomes spiritually destructive when it is driven by greed, when it exploits others, when it becomes the primary source of meaning and identity. The key is what Al-Ghazali calls conscious sufficiency, having enough to meet legitimate needs and fulfill responsibilities without accumulating so much that wealth becomes a source of spiritual distraction or moral corruption. This principle applies both individually and socially. Individuals should seek levels of wealth that enable service to higher purposes rather than simply maximizing personal accumulation. Societies should organize economic systems to promote widespread access to sufficiency rather than creating extreme disparities. And when you extend these principles to political governance, you get a vision of social organization that serves human flourishing rather than just maintaining power or maximizing productivity. Political authority should be exercised by those who possess both practical competence and sufficient spiritual development to resist corruption. The ideal leader combines wisdom about effective governance with wisdom about ultimate human purposes. But Al-Ghazali also recognizes that institutions must function effectively even when administered by people of ordinary spiritual development. Systems need checks and balances, accountability mechanisms, educational structures that prepare citizens for responsible participation. The goal is not utopia administered by spiritually perfect leaders. The goal is creating social arrangements that serve transformation as effectively as possible, given human limitations. This is what Al-Ghazali means by the social dimension of spiritual life. Not that you withdraw from the world after achieving realization, but that realization enhances your capacity to engage the world wisely, ethically, effectively. The mystic who has tasted divine reality does not become less concerned with justice. The mystic becomes more capable of recognizing injustice and working to address it without being corrupted by the fight. The contemplative who has experienced certainty about ultimate truth does not abandon social responsibility. The contemplative brings clarity, patience, and wisdom to social challenges that reactive consciousness cannot match. And the person who has purified their heart from spiritual diseases does not retreat into self-concern. Purification naturally expands awareness beyond narrow ego interest to include genuine concern for the welfare of all conscious beings. This is the paradox that Al-Ghazali lives and teaches. The more you develop spiritually, the more capable you become of serving practically. The deeper your realization, the greater your effectiveness in the world. Because transformation does not remove you from reality. It shows you reality as it actually is, rather than as ego distortion perceives it. And seeing clearly enables wise action in ways that confused perception cannot achieve. But this requires integration rather than choosing between spiritual and worldly life. You do not have to abandon family to pursue transformation. You transform through family when you approach relationship consciously. You do not have to renounce economic activity. You purify economic activity by conducting it ethically and using wealth to serve purposes beyond mere accumulation. You do not have to withdraw from politics. You engage politics with the wisdom that spiritual practice develops, while avoiding the corruption that power typically produces. This integration is difficult. It requires constant vigilance against falling into purely worldly concern on one side or escapist spirituality on the other. But it is the only path that honors the full complexity of human existence. You are both individual soul seeking ultimate truth and social being embedded in relationships, communities, systems that require your participation. And Al-Ghazali shows that these dimensions are not opposed. They are complementary aspects of a single life lived consciously, ethically, spiritually. The mystic does not escape the world. The mystic brings light into the world, and this light, this clarity that comes from purified consciousness, this wisdom that emerges from direct knowledge of ultimate reality, is precisely what the world needs most. Nearly 1,000 years have passed since Al-Ghazali wrote his books and walked his path from doubt to certainty through transformation. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have advanced beyond what he could imagine. The intellectual frameworks of his time have been supplemented and challenged by new discoveries, new philosophies, new ways of understanding human consciousness and the structure of reality. And yet his teaching remains luminous, not as historical artifact, but as living wisdom that speaks to permanent features of human existence. Because the questions Al-Ghazali addressed are not artifacts of 11th century Islam, they are perennial. Every generation confronts them anew in forms that feel contemporary, but are essentially timeless. How can I know anything with certainty? How should I live? What gives life meaning? Is transformation possible? How do I become more than I currently am? These questions cannot be answered through historical progress or technological advancement. They require what they have always required: honest confrontation with the limits of thinking, systematic practice of transformation, and openness to knowledge that comes through grace rather than achievement. This is why Al-Ghazali's influence extended far beyond the Islamic world where he lived and wrote. Medieval Jewish philosophers like Maimonides engaged his work and adapted his insights to their own tradition. Christian scholastics like Thomas Aquinas, whether they read him directly or encountered his ideas through intermediaries, developed similar approaches to integrating reason with revelation, philosophy with mystical theology. European philosophers of later centuries, though often unaware of their debt, wrestled with questions he had already explored. Descartes' methodical doubt echoes Al-Ghazali's skeptical crisis. Hume's analysis of causation parallels Al-Ghazali's occasionalism. Pascal's wager resonates with Al-Ghazali's recognition that ultimate questions cannot be settled through proof alone. But Al-Ghazali's most enduring influence is not through specific arguments that later thinkers adopted or refined. It is through the pattern he established, the integration of rational inquiry with transformative practice, the recognition that ultimate knowledge requires becoming rather than just thinking, the insistence that consciousness has capacities beyond what reason alone can access. This pattern remains valid because human consciousness has not changed in its fundamental structure. The diseases that corrupt the heart are the same now as they were in 11th century Baghdad. The need for certainty, for meaning, for transformation. These hungers are permanent features of what it means to be human, and the path Al-Ghazali mapped remains walkable, not because he discovered something no one else has known, but because he articulated with unprecedented clarity and comprehensiveness what the great spiritual traditions have always taught. Transformation is possible. Human consciousness can access knowledge beyond what thinking provides. Life can be organized in ways that serve awakening rather than obstruct it, but this knowledge is not theoretical. It cannot be transmitted through reading alone. It requires practice, the systematic work of examining your own consciousness, recognizing your diseases, cultivating healthier patterns, submitting to disciplines that purify the heart and open it to realities thinking cannot reach. This is what makes Al-Ghazali's teaching eternal rather than merely historical. He does not offer beliefs to be accepted on authority. He offers a path to be walked, practices to be engaged, a transformation to be undergone. And the transformation, when it happens, produces knowledge that confirms what revelation describes and practice makes possible, direct awareness of realities that philosophy can point toward, but thinking cannot prove. This is not anti-rational mysticism, it is trans-rational wisdom. It includes reason's questions, respects reason's achievements, and arrives at awareness that reason cannot generate through its own effort, but that it can recognize as valid when consciousness has been prepared to receive it. The eternal teaching is this: you cannot think your way to ultimate truth. You must become capable of knowing truth through transformation. And transformation requires surrender, practice, patience, and grace. This teaching remains relevant in a scientific age, because science, for all its achievements in understanding physical processes and material structures, cannot answer the questions that matter most to human consciousness. Why does anything exist rather than nothing? What is consciousness? What makes life meaningful? How should I live? What happens when I die? These are not scientific questions in the sense that they cannot be answered through empirical investigation and rational analysis of data. They are questions that require different methods, different faculties, different forms of knowledge than science provides. Al-Ghazali shows how to honor scientific achievements while recognizing that science has limits. How to respect the guidance of revelation while insisting that revealed truth must be experienced rather than merely believed. How to integrate different sources of knowledge without reducing them to a single method. And this integration, this recognition that ultimate truth requires multiple approaches working together, is what contemporary thought needs most. We live in an age of fragmentation. Science dismisses spiritual knowledge as subjective feeling. Religion rejects scientific findings that challenge inherited beliefs. Philosophy becomes abstract game disconnected from lived experience. Spirituality becomes vague emotionalism without intellectual rigor. Al-Ghazali's example shows how to overcome these fragmentations, not through compromise that dilutes all approaches, but through recognition of the unique contribution each makes when properly understood and practiced within its appropriate domain. Reason prepares the ground, revelation provides the framework, practice does the work, experience confirms the truth. This fourfold integration creates the possibility of knowledge that is both rigorous and transformative, intellectually honest and spiritually profound, rationally defensible and experientially certain. And this is the gift Al-Ghazali left, not a system to be believed, but a path to be walked, not arguments to be memorized, but practices to be engaged. Not certainty handed to you, but certainty discovered through becoming someone capable of knowing what you could not know before. The path remains open, the practices still work, the transformation is still possible. Everything he described nearly 1,000 years ago remains valid for consciousness willing to do the work. The purification of the heart, the training in awareness, the breaking of attachment, the systematic development of qualities that make spiritual perception possible. And when you walk this path, not believing what Al-Ghazali believed, but practicing what he practiced, you discover what he discovered, that reality has dimensions thinking cannot reach, that consciousness can be transformed, that knowledge more certain than proof is accessible to those willing to surrender control and submit to disciplines that purify awareness. This is the eternal teaching, not because it was spoken long ago, but because it addresses permanent features of human consciousness and permanent possibilities for transformation that do not change across centuries or cultures. The questions remain, the path remains, the light remains, and you, carrying your own doubts and hungers and questions, are invited into the same journey that Al-Ghazali walked, from skeptical crisis through systematic investigation to transformative practice to direct knowledge that thinking cannot provide but experience confirms. The architecture of doubt can become the foundation for certainty of a different kind. The collapse of intellectual knowledge can create space for awareness that includes thinking and transcends it. The wound can become the doorway. This is what Al-Ghazali discovered in the ruins of his certainty, and this is what remains available to every consciousness willing to walk the path with honesty, courage, and surrender to realities beyond the ego's control. Al-Ghazali returned to the world carrying light he had not possessed before, not dramatic illumination that removed all uncertainty, not mystical experiences that elevated him above ordinary human struggle, but quiet certainty about truths that mattered most, and wisdom about how to live that certainty without betraying either its spiritual depth or its practical demands. He taught again, not from the need for recognition that had driven his earlier career, but from recognition that others were searching for what he had found and needed guidance from someone who had walked the path. He wrote, not to display brilliance or win arguments, but to map the territory of transformation as clearly as he could for those willing to undertake the journey. He engaged with politics, family life, social responsibilities, not as distractions from spiritual practice, but as dimensions of existence where spiritual wisdom must be applied if it is to be real rather than merely theoretical. This is the integrated life, not choosing between spiritual and worldly, not alternating between retreat and engagement, but living from a center that has been relocated through transformation. The center is no longer intellectual mastery. It is not social status or material security or even spiritual achievement. The center is the direct knowledge of divine reality that came through purification and grace, knowledge that remains present as quiet awareness underneath all the activities of ordinary life. This knowledge does not make difficulties disappear. Al-Ghazali still faced political challenges, family concerns, physical illness, financial pressures. Transformation does not create immunity to the conditions of human existence, but it changes your relationship to these conditions. You respond differently when you are grounded in certainty about what ultimately matters. You do not become indifferent to worldly concerns, but you are not enslaved by them either. You care about outcomes without being destroyed when things do not go as you hoped. You work for justice without assuming that your efforts can create perfection. You love deeply while recognizing that everything in this world is temporary, including the people you love and your own existence. This is not detachment in the sense of not caring. It is freedom from being controlled by circumstances while remaining engaged with them. And this freedom emerges naturally from the knowledge Al-Ghazali gained through practice. When you know with experiential certainty that your existence depends moment by moment on divine sustaining power that you cannot control, you stop trying to secure yourself through accumulation or achievement or social position. When you recognize that consciousness itself is gift rather than possession, you stop identifying so completely with the thoughts and emotions that arise in awareness. When you experience divine mercy as the fundamental texture of reality, you stop seeing difficulties as punishments and start seeing them as opportunities for developing qualities you need. This is not belief adopted on authority. This is awareness that transforms how you perceive everything. And it is what makes the integrated life possible, because integration is not a technique you apply. It is what happens naturally when consciousness has been purified and awakened to realities beyond what thinking can grasp. You do not have to force yourself to be patient when you recognize that everything unfolds according to wisdom beyond your understanding. Patience becomes your natural response. You do not have to effort toward gratitude when you perceive that every breath, every moment of awareness, Every capacity you possess is gift. Gratitude becomes the texture of your experience. You do not have to manufacture compassion when your heart has been purified of the diseases that make you see others as competitors or threats. Compassion flows naturally from clarity about what all human beings share. This is what Al-Ghazali calls living from the center, and it is what his teaching aims to make possible for others, not through believing what he believed, but through practicing what he practiced, until your own consciousness undergoes the transformation that makes direct knowledge accessible. The practices remain as he described them: self-examination that reveals your diseases with honesty, purification disciplines that gradually heal the distortions, devotional practices that train awareness, meditation that creates space for realities beyond thinking, service that breaks the tyranny of self-concern. These are not optional for anyone seriously seeking transformation. They are the mechanics of how consciousness changes. And while the details may vary depending on temperament and tradition and circumstance, the essential pattern remains constant. You must see your diseases clearly. You must engage practices that heal them. You must persist through periods when nothing seems to be happening. You must remain open to grace that you cannot control or predict. And gradually, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually through sustained practice, the heart begins to clear, the veils begin to thin, and you start to perceive realities that were always present but hidden by the noise of ego concern and the distortions of spiritual disease. This is the return that Al-Ghazali made and that his teaching makes possible for others. Not escape from the world, but return to the world with vision clarified, heart purified, consciousness aligned with truth that thinking alone could not reach. You live the same life in many ways, same family, same work, same challenges, but you live it from a different place, from the center that has been found through transformation rather than from the scattered fragments of untransformed consciousness. And this makes all the difference, not in avoiding difficulty, but in meeting difficulty without being destroyed by it. Not in achieving perfection, but in accepting your imperfection while continuing to grow. Not in knowing everything, but in knowing what matters most with a certainty that doubt cannot touch. Al-Ghazali died in 1111 at 53 years old in his hometown of Tus. He died as he had lived his later years teaching, writing, practicing the disciplines he had discovered, serving those who sought his guidance. He left behind books that would shape Islamic intellectual and spiritual life for centuries. He left a path that remains walkable. He left an example of how consciousness can move from doubt to certainty through transformation rather than through argument. But most importantly, he left the recognition that you do not have to remain trapped in the questions that torment you. That transformation is possible. That consciousness has capacities beyond what most people ever discover. That the light you are seeking is available to those willing to do the work required to receive it. This is the teaching that lasts, not as historical information, but as invitation into the same journey. The architecture of doubt that feels like collapse can become the clearing where truth reveals itself. The crisis that seems to destroy certainty can create space for awareness more fundamental than proof. The wound can become the doorway. The emptiness can become fullness. The darkness can become the place where light breaks through. But this transformation does not happen through thinking about it. It happens through practice, through the systematic work of purification, the patient training of consciousness, the humble surrender to realities beyond ego's control. And when it happens, not all at once but gradually, not completely but sufficiently, you discover what Al-Ghazali discovered, that reality is more than what thinking can grasp, that consciousness is more than what you assumed it to be, that transformation is not only possible, but is what human existence is ultimately about. This is the eternal teaching. This is the light in the ruins. This is what remains when everything you thought you knew collapses and something truer emerges from the wreckage. The path is ancient. The practices are tested. The transformation is available. Everything Al-Ghazali wrote, everything he practiced, everything he discovered and taught, it remains here, waiting for consciousness willing to walk beyond thinking into the direct knowledge that transforms rather than merely informs. The invitation stands. The path is open, the light is present. You need only begin.